Welcome everyone. On behalf of IIM Ranchi and my co-host, Professor Ansuman Hajarika, I thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Dr. Aditya Misra and I am faculty member at IIM Ranchi and co-chair at Atal Bihari Vajpayee Center for Leadership, Policy and Governance, which is a center of excellence under IIM Ranchi. This center is involved in multidisciplinary research related to leadership, policy and governance. In addition to that, we also organize seminars, roundtables, lecture series to make sure that the knowledge reaches to every needful. Today, we are conducting the webinar on Dare to Lead Through Crisis, presented by Dr. G Raghuraman. He is the Managing Director and Chief Risk Officer Growth Markets at Accenture. He has 31 years of experience, in which 29 years are with Accenture only. He is presently handling the growth market covering 80 countries. Prior to this role, he was COO for Asia Pacific, Africa and Middle East for financial services, covering a wide range of responsibilities including operations, risk and quality, finance, strategy, leadership development, marketing and human resources. He has recently completed his PhD from IIM Lucknow on leadership and resilience. He is an MBA from IIM Lucknow and a graduate in mechanical engineering from College of Engineering Guindi, Anna University, Chennai. Mr. Raghuraman recently concluded his doctoral thesis on a highly topical subject of resilience of CEOs. The intense study was based on one-on-one interviews with several CEOs, CXOs from 6 countries: USA, UK, India, Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong. The topic, Dare to Lead Through Crisis, in his point of view and immersive presentation about weathering adversities and growing from them. It combines his practical experience of working with about 50 leading corporations over the last 3 decades with a deep research on the subject of resilience. And I take this opportunity to introduce one more personality under whose leadership IIM Ranchi has leapt from NIF ranking 40 in 2018 to rank 20 in 2020. I welcome our Honorable Director, Professor Shailendra Singh. He himself is an eminent scholar and able administrator. It is our privilege to learn from him on everyday basis. Now, without further ado, I request our Honorable Director, Professor Shailendra Singh, to say a few words and introduce the center to the audience. And I would also request Professor Hajarika to please take over and coordinate the webinar after Director Sir's speech. Thank you. Thank you all. Over to Director Sir.
So thank you, Aditya, and welcome to all the participants, and especially Raghuraman, who has been researching for a very long time on the topic of resilience among leaders and how that affects their career trajectory. So welcome, Raghu. And let me just give a very brief introduction of the center. Atal Bihari Vajpayee Center for Leadership, Policy and was established in 2019 and has been inaugurated by General V.K. Singh. This name has been given to give tribute to a statesman under whose stewardship the state was created. And we aspire to become a vibrant knowledge center which takes forward the scholarly conversation in leadership, policy and governance. We also want to become a center, a think tank, which provides consultation in the area of governance, public policy, and contribute to the planning and implementation of the policies at the state and center level. Further, we envisage in long term to start a postgraduate program in public policy. We have already started many scholarly conversation, and one of that will include the webinar. We have conducted summer school, winter school, and many other seminars. And recently, Honorable Vice President of India, Venkaiah Naidu has given the second lecture of the Center of Policy, Leadership Policy.
Session for a total of 1 hour, in which Dr. Raghuraman will speak for around 40 minutes. After the session by Dr. Raghuraman, we'll have a few minutes time for a discussion where you will be able to ask questions. To prevent background noise, we will try to have the questions show your chat box only until and unless it is extremely essential that you ask it in person. We will try to limit the questions to the chat box, and we can pick up the questions from there. In case there are any queries, we request you to wait till the end. Dr. Raghuraman would be taking his time to answer the questions then. So thank you everyone for joining us again, and Dr. Raghuraman, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, or to others who seem to have joined from other parts of the world, good evening. I want to start by thanking Professor Shalinda, whom I have had an opportunity to know from the past, who also has been a guide, and Professor Aditya, who's been coordinating this. Before I get into the details of the session itself, I do want to thank a number of giants, I would say, from my experience in Accenture, with clients, some of whom may be on this call, who have been part of my journey, both on the subject of resilience as well as a variety of learnings that I have been through for many decades. So welcome and join me in the session. My request to all of you who joined today is be open to exploring with me this subject. It's a subject that everybody has a point of view. If you search for resilience in the Google, you might find quite a large number of different terms. But we are here to talk about how can we be openly investigating this topic that we are now calling as crisis, leading in a crisis, and how can you do it with some daring and courage. So those are the three ones. And my first request is, of course, if you can empty your cups, because all of us have our own views of problems and hardships and adversities. But for the next 30, 40 minutes, kind of empty your cup so that we can look at what others have gone through. As I said, we will cover three different things from different dimensions. We will talk about the whole subject, about a hardship or an adversity or a crisis, what others have done. We'll also talk about how others have led themselves through it, how they have actually gone through to thrive out of it rather than be struggling through it. And of course, what could we learn from them for us to conduct ourselves in this kind of a fairly turbulent environment we live in today. There's one word of caution, and it's a bit of a risk I'm taking. There are a number of academics on the call. We have professors and we have heads of departments and directors. I also know that there are a number of practitioners, and I'm trying to kind of keep the balance and bridge to share, which is the same thing I did in my research that Professor Aditya introduced you to, where I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic, but trying to sort of get a bridge doing my doctorate between academics and practice, and thereby take something back to the working world that each one of us know about. So you will sometimes hear some academic terms, sometimes you will hear some very practical things. So just stay with me through the 30, 40 minutes, please. If I were to ask in a meeting where we would all be in person and not COVID constrained, I normally ask, what is the one word that describes the current times for each one of us? For me, that one word is disruption. And what I mean by disruption is just this session. I mean, what is not disrupted today? I can think of food chain is disrupted, supply chain is disrupted, health is disrupted, Education is disrupted. We're talking about schools and colleges doing it exactly like what you and I are going through. Our personal lives are disrupted, and so are our aspirations and to some extent even our fears. So it is what the military term UCA represents as a very complex world, volatile, uncertain, complex, with a lot of ambiguity. In fact, from the city I'm talking in, which is Chennai, I'm not even sure what will be the amount of restrictions related to COVID on the 1st of August. So it's a fairly interesting times that seem to have thrown it. If we take a step back and listen to ourselves saying, what all have we seen around in the last 20, 30 years or more? We have actually gone through a lot of disruptions. Some of us in India have seen the stock market scam. We have seen the financial crisis that's normally called as a Lehman crash. We know about the 9/11 attack. We know about what's happened to the stock markets. And right now we're in the midst of what we could call as a definite crisis, which is a pandemic in the form of COVID. That's the environment we live in every day. In fact, 6 or 7 years back when I started research, some of it were true, COVID was not. But that triggered the discussion with many chief execs to understand how they saw it and what we could learn from them. That was the trigger to the whole exercise. At the same time, this is the paradox of life. On the other side, every one of us have multiple gadgets. We are connected with technology as we listen to this today. There are chief executives who talk about a digital transformation. They talk about reinventing their industries and businesses. And the same thing that we are worried about on one side is also providing a paradoxical excitement to us on the other side. And they coexist. We feel hassled about one and we feel excited about the other. That's a typical definition of the word paradox. And we live in paradoxical times. And when I went into the conversation with many chief execs, they did talk about some of this, but they talked a lot about something else that I will share with you over the next few minutes. One of the questions that I would ask you is, before COVID, last year, how many times did you visit your bank branch? The truth is, I probably did not. I did not visit my bank branch even once last year. I don't know how many of you even did. And if you ask the CEOs of large banks, they think the whole banking industry, like many others, are in fact going through dramatic changes. And they talk about it converting it into a software business, they're converting it into a utility business, but it is a very significantly transforming situation for many industries. Or just ask yourself, in the last 1 week, how many days did you not use any of the social media? WhatsApp or Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever else that actually became the basis of even this session getting popularized, if I may say. That's the world we live in. In fact, this is part of the truth of disruption that has become part of our life that going forward determines how we're going to run our lives. There are also other truths, and the truth that's the reason for a discussion like this. The psychologist actually said, Scott Peck said, life is difficult. We all feel this many times, if not at least sometimes in our life. Helen Keller actually says, a happy life is about mastering hardships, not about not having problems, but actually getting over them. And as part of my research, this is a article by Bonanno and Mancini, who've done a lot of work on resilience, who say almost all individuals will experience at least one potentially traumatic event in their lifetime. Some of us have had more than one, but definitely one is likely. And it is those kinds of experiences that create an opportunity for us to learn and become different. And that's exactly what we'll be discussing today. We talked about paradox. It is in this paradox that you need to learn, I need to learn to lead, and every one of us have to learn to thrive and survive. So our first position is to be willing to accept that we will be in the middle of a highly disrupted situation and environment. So as they say, welcome to chaos. One of the questions that I'm very keen to have people reflect on is, if you were to think about the theory of evolution, so many species have survived, so many species have not survived the millions of years of Earth. Who stands the strongest chance of survival, the best chance of survival, the strongest species or the smartest species? And when I ask this question to many people, a lot of people give different experiences. If it was the strongest, then I guess we would still have dinosaurs walking on the earth. If it was the smartest, it could probably be something else. Interestingly, neither. Actually, the best chances of survival, according to Darwin, are those species which are the most adaptive, those that can adapt to changing situations and conditions, which you could be smart about the past or strong about your capability, but is insufficient. What I now want to do in the next 15, 20 minutes is to share a number of stories with you, a couple of stories about way past, like 50, 60 years back, a few stories that came out of my research, and then from there draw conclusions of what we could use to provide our own sort of learning platform for managing ourselves. I don't know how many of you can recognize this photograph. It is a photograph from early part of the 20th century, way back, 20, 30 years back, 20, 30 years into the beginning of the century. It is a concentration camp. Unlike the COVID timings, you could see that within a very small area, there are 4 or 5 people sleeping. These are people who lived with 1 meal a day in harsh, cold conditions, really cold conditions. We're talking about sub-zero temperatures with just one piece of cloth, as you can see many of them having. That's the only piece of cloth, no winter clothing. And that is the ordeal that they survived. And if I were to look at one person's life that came out of this ordeal, this is about a person who was born in Vienna. He served as a doctor and was taken, imprisoned, and moved to a ghetto. And then from there moved to a concentration camp, like the photograph I showed you. And then was separated from his family, was all alone. And imagine that situation. There are people around you who are dying. You don't get enough food. There is no winter clothing. It's bloody cold, really cold. And many people that you saw today don't live tomorrow. And in effect, some of them were actually digging graves to put those people in. In that sitting, in that kind of position, what could you do? What should be your attitude? Can you really hope for anything? Can you really be optimistic? And just to be clear, this person went on doing this for more than 2 years. So, hopes, few days, optimism, let's grit it out, etc., really doesn't take you that far. For those of you who may have guessed and may have read this book about this person, about Viktor Frankl, who wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning, he lived through to 1997, almost 92 years. Died of old age, not out of the problems he had. Published a number of books, got a number of honorary doctorates. And when he was asked, how did he survive that camp, the concentration camp? But his point was, I suffered fully, objectively, and thereby I transcended suffering. He said, I did that by actually giving lectures on an area that his strength was, which is about working with people. And he was giving lectures to imaginary audiences about psychotherapeutic experiences in a concentration camp. And all this when there were no guarantees he would live tomorrow. And the reason I talk about it is not just the story, about the core messages that are very important for us as we handle our crisis. About a few important messages he left for us about his ability to adapt, make some authentic choices, and inspire himself, and thereby give us the choice of inspiring ourselves. And he said, between stimulus and response, stimulus of all the difficulties and the hardships and the problems that keep coming at you, and your response, he says, there is a space. There's an important piece. There's a space. And in that space, each one of us have the power to choose how we respond, how we will choose to respond despite all our odds stacked up against yourself. And he says it is exactly in that response that lies your growth and your freedom from all the suffering that you see around yourself. And he says, everything can be taken away from a person, from a human person, except one's own choice of the attitude in that situation and that circumstances. Quite an amazing position for somebody 60, 70 years back in a situation of no hope to be able to reflect and give us that point. Very interestingly, in my research over the last few years, I heard various shades of this coming out from chief execs and chairmen of companies, and I will share with you shortly. But stay with that. I mean, it's a very powerful reflection about between stimulus that comes from all the problems and hardships that we get hit by and the response. Our response, we have a choice. And that choice makes the difference between whether we will have the courage to go after those adversities or not. There were other examples, so he was not alone. I mean, there is this person who was captured and put in solitary confinement for 7 years. And as he says, many people who were highly optimistic actually collapsed because they always kept saying that we'll get released next Christmas, we will get released next Easter. They did not. And just that disappointment of over-optimism killed him. His response was to detach from the moment, resisting despair. And actually, despite being in captivity, solitary confinement, he created a code that other prisoners could learn and became a method of communication that helped everybody survive, including himself. So he invented a code that the people who were holding them in prison could not understand, but the other prisoners could. Quite an amazing method of detaching from all the despair and pain to find something that helped many, many of his co-prisoners survive and actually get out of prison. There's also the example of Jewish nurses who were held captive in a concentration camp in Second World War, very similar to this. And they survived because they found purpose in giving hope to others that they served, sick and dying people. And that focus on what they could do on their duties made the difference between them falling into the trap of self-pity versus actually helping others get a sense of hope and to be able to survive. Quite a combination of examples in which they basically chose their actions, adapted to the situation which seemed out of hope, and thereby inspired themselves and the others to survive. Alvin Toffler, many, many years back, told us that in 21st century, the most important thing that we need to learn is to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And probably true for every one of us. In fact, right now, we are learning about social distancing, staying safe, and still getting on with our lives, whether it is to go and find food in supermarkets, which only work for some time, and cleaning ourselves and all that stuff. And so the key point about surviving adversities is our ability to learn to adapt, learn to be able to make those choices, difficult choices, and still make those choices. I now come to my favorite topic, which sets the tone of sharing with you some of my actual research findings, which is on the topic of resilience. When I spoke to a number of almost 50 plus chief execs, chairmen, CEOs in those many countries. And it was an open conversation. It was a qualitative discussion of, you tell us what you thought were some of the most challenging experiences you had, significant adversities that affected you. And the two quotes that reminded me when they responded, one was from Diane Kotu, is about beyond your education, beyond your experience or any other single factor, it will be resilience which will determine whether you succeed or fail. And of course, Nelson Mandela said it very simplistically, where he said, it's not about not failing. Of course, in situations people fail, but it is about every time you fall, can you come back up? Can you bounce back up despite taking the hit? And I'll give you an example of a COO of a really iconic lifestyle brand. I'm not quoting the name because then you can guess who it is. During my research, I asked him to share his experiences. And this is what he said. He talked about her personal experience He was not talking about 9/11 or Lehman crash. He was talking about his own personal challenge, where he said, my only son, who was only 4 years old, was diagnosed with leukemia. 4 years old. I mean, we were shocked. And he says, I was agonized. Why should this be happening to me and my wife? Or why is this happening to such a small child, young child? He went through a lot of, doctors, specialists, treatments, whatever. And then they found, after some detailed research, that this was a particularly difficult form, very, very difficult, virulent form of leukemia. He had a technical term called Philadelphia chromosome. We are not medical doctors, so. But he says the only permanent solution to this, which has high rate of success, is to do a blood transplant from a sibling. Only child, so there is no sibling. So the mother's blood or the father's blood does not work. He goes on a search all over the world, doesn't find anything, and at last finds one solution after 9-10 months of sheer persistence, patience, disappointment in Germany to do blood re-engineering, which is pretty much taking out all your blood and then replacing it with somebody else's blood and re-engineering. I mean, sounds quite painful, frankly. But when he had to make a choice, where that particular option had only managed 32 cases till then, and with only 25% survival rate, which basically meant only 8 people had succeeded and come out of this problem. And he had to take a decision whether he should subject his only child of little less than 5 years by now to go through this high-risk option. Put yourself in that shoes. Empathize with that person for a minute in terms of what should have been going on in his head. He's still running his job as COO, just to be clear, on how does he survive, how does the son survive, and how does he convince his family that is in fact the right thing to do. That's an adversity for you, personal, significant, and something he had to live through. Now, I'm not going through what he did. He went through that, and the good news is his son survived and is still doing well. We fast forward many years, and the same COO talks about another experience now in professional life, where he says huge profit pressure in the business, but the group would just not lay off people, and nobody had heard of laying off in that group. But they had to take a significant amount of cost reduction across multiple dimensions. He was the person to drive it. And when he started pushing on it, he found many, many obstacles to his actions. And he also discovered that many people who were with him in the beginning were beginning to become kind of, neutral, not highly supportive, when it started to get very, very solid headwinds, whether it was with the union, whether it was with, the whole emotion of having to let people go and shut down factories, very difficult. And his learning from there was, it is so simple to limit yourself and blame it on all these reasons why you should not continue. And he said, I persisted to it because I knew about the limits of my persistence, which had already been tested because of my son's illness. I wasn't going to give up what was the right thing to do. And in this professional situation, I persisted, and we took the decisions that were appropriate in that context. So despite it being stormy and we had to do a lockout and we had all kinds of challenges, I persisted through it because one had seen something quite significant already and learned from it. I'll now share with you one other example just to make the point. And this is from a Harvard Business Review article. You can look it up and read it as well, about a very successful management consultant called Mongorian, who wrote this article in 2007. And he said, after a number of years of successful practice, suddenly he had an unprovoked disc rupture in his back, in his spinal cord, and the bottom half of his body was permanently paralyzed, still paralyzed. Many months in the hospital and many years in physical therapy. Imagine that you're completely taken off your profession, you've lost half your body, you've now become so dependent. And he felt emotions that are normal for a human being. Anger as to why it happened to me, sadness, what am I going to do? How is this going to turn out for my life? And more importantly, my family is so badly affected, my friends, my business associates, a recognition that not only am I impacted, my whole circle is badly impacted, and it's permanently now altered in a bad way. And some of the words he uses is very dark days. Life was a constant struggle, absolute struggle. In those kind of circumstances, what should be our attitude? Of course, we can give up and lead a life of self-pity and helplessness. How do you respond? What happened to a successful consultant who is now kind of jobless, movementless, in difficult place? How do you move on from here? Very interesting examples. He says, after those initial emotions, he said, I was lucky. Imagine losing half your body and thinking you're lucky. Strange, isn't it? Choices that you make. Lucky that I wasn't killed. And then he says, I really realize that we all are bound with a renewable capacity for resilience. We don't know it. We constrain ourselves and limit ourselves, but we have a built-in power to regenerate and grow. And he says, remember that in that crisis, your identity is in fact changed, threatened, and sometimes dramatically altered. It completely shatters your dignity. And he made a choice to not put limits on own self. In fact, at some point he says the new me, that he went on to actually, conduct his business, although he was in a wheelchair, driven and fearless. Sometimes he said, I felt invincible for a person who felt self-pity and felt days filled with darkness. And he says that we underestimate our ability to withstand crisis. And then he says, I now experience my life as full of adventures. Although I experience it sitting down, in many ways I feel I'm standing taller than ever. To me, personally, an extremely inspiring reflection of how he feels despite all the physical challenges, all the sort of mental difficulties that he is feeling. And then on top of that, he then talks about resilience. Now we'll talk about resilience. And before I talk about examples of resilience, this is a good example of resilience. I want us all to understand what is this word called resilience. And there are many words. People use different ones. I'm going to take a minute for you to just read what it says in literature. It is about, in Oxford, it says, if you look it up, it says about leaping back, or your ability to recover quickly from difficult conditions. The American Psychology Association defines resilience as a process of adapting to adversity, to trauma, to a number of things that you feel threatened about. It's a dynamic process, a positive adaptation kind of process. You adapt to situations and still come out of it. And then some other people use the word thriving. How do you thrive in it? The interesting aspect is 3 things stand out from the research about resilience. The first one is adversity exists. It kind of knocks you down. And second is, as you go through the process of recovering from that, there's a positive adaptation. You come out of it better. In fact, there's an article somebody has written which says that what does not kill you, in fact, strengthens you. You come out of it stronger, more powerful. And the third is it's a process. In technical terms, in psychology, process means it's learnable. It is something one can develop. In fact, that's the heart of this whole presentation when I thought about it, is it's not something that you have or don't have. It's not 0 or 1. You can develop. I can develop. And we have seen people do it, as I just explained to you. The other aspect is, you all want to lead and be leaders. How does resilience connect with leadership? It does. And again, here he says that leaders have typically endured hardships, and they have used it to overcome them and make a shift in their own focus from being self-centered, self-interested to a larger, broader collective interest. Zalesnik has coined an interesting term called twice-born individuals. He says leaders are typically twice-born because they've been knocked down once, and then they have kind of born again as a much better person who is ready now to face more hardships. Bennis and Thomas, in their book on Crucibles of Leadership, actually says leaders come out of it finding meaning and learning from those negative events. And basically, they treat hardships as developmental experiences that help them become better, develop to help others. And crises, failures, big changes, they all create new skill set and generate new perspectives. So in effect, adversities could actually help us all. So it's not as if something that we should give up on. It can really help us. And enduring those hardships, and they may not be hardships we created, right? COVID, it just came and hit us. But while enduring it and overcoming it, we actually get better. We become better leaders. So in effect, for us to lead through crisis, I think the first thing we need to recognize and accept is that we don't control the circumstances and the adversities and that come and hit us. We can only shape and choose our assessment and response to it. And of course, our resilience is demonstrated by how we assess the adversity, how we cope with it and put some stuff to cope with it, how we learn from it, and thereby by learning, build a reservoir. Remember the COO example. He learned from something quite personally challenging to easily use in business because that prepared him for that future challenge and almost kind of got him ready to be quite successful. So in that sense, it's quite a holistic, supportive process and an essential process. I consider, almost, as we say, the 3 R's, the foundation of, reading, writing, arithmetic. I think the 4th R is, in fact, resilience, because that's what is going to shape us as we go into both our personal and professional lives. I now want to move quickly into kind of the other dimension of all this is a bit theoretical. How do we get stuff done? Because at the end of the day, we all have to get things done. And research typically says, there's nothing wrong with strategy. Typically, it doesn't work well because execution doesn't work that well. Execution fails. I don't know how many of you can connect to this statement. This was a statement done in a workshop or a seminar by somebody quite famous long, long ago in the 80s. And he said, here is a mock-up of something. It's quite cool. And this is what we'll be making in the 80s. And if you've guessed it, this is Steve Jobs talking about a laptop. And I suspect many of you are actually watching this webinar on that notebook or a laptop. Execution, from having that idea, having that understanding, execution. I now want to share with you a story about what one chairman of a very large IT services company, he was also vice chairman of many other companies, quite well known actually, shared about his experience about adversity and execution. I'll take you through this, but you must understand the situation, right? This is a person talking about an experience when he was less than 10 years old. So really young. And he talks about, he was quite a rich family. His father started a bank. The bank went bust. And the family almost overnight was pushed from being rich to poor. Poor enough for him to, instead of taking a tram or a bus in the city, had to walk to school and things like that. And he says, I watched my mother, and here we are talking about many decades back, so we're talking about a fairly difficult situation in which not many women were as advanced as they are today. Meeting investors, meeting depositors, giving them conviction that we are going to repay all your investment and loans that were given to us in full from our personal cash, not from the limited liability company, not based on corporate governance, just out of a very strong conviction of how they wanted to manage the crisis, okay? And he said the thing is, she went into the epicenter of crisis. She would take command. And that was what I learned from that experience when I was not even in my teens. Fast forward 20, 30 years or more, he became the chief exec of a company and the market had a demand recession. Lots of chaos, capacity rendered surplus. He had to do cost reduction. He had to take his team along. And his experience, as he said in the interview, is in a crisis, you have to go into the eye of the storm, PG. As a leader, you have to be visible, you have to be in the center of it, you have to give confidence, and then, along with communication, show consistency of actions. Execute relentlessly every day doing that. In fact, he gave an example of actually saying, despite being a CEO, because we were doing cost reduction and there was quite a distance between where he lived and the head office was and the factory is, he used to take overnight buses like everybody else's, non-air conditioned buses on difficult roads to reach the factory the next day in order to continue his work. Which he says many, many years later, workers came back and told us, saying, that showed us this level of execution rigor that they had to also display in their work, and thereby created a huge opportunity to turn around. There was somebody else who talked about other examples. In fact, one good example was about this company which makes water heaters. And they were 2 weeks before the peak season. And peak season, as you know, for water heaters is when winter starts. And he is in the city on TV. He can see that his factory in a different town is up in flames, completely burning. And the goods are lost, machinery was not, huge problem. In less than 10 days after that incident, they started production. They actually created tin sheet roofs. They created people who created a temporary makeshift structure that workers were keen to work. They got the permissions and stuff that really made it happen. And his reaction was, it is in the crisis that you know how much of positivity that is there with the ecosystem around you. All your goodwill will come to bear in that situation, PG. So it's not that bad as we all make it out to be. I know we're going to be up on time, so I'm going to start into a little bit of closing. It is about, execution is about holding your ground and being consistent in terms of actions as you actually go through that whole situation. In terms of closing, I did want to bring you back to a few messages that I've been talking about so far. The first one, we talked about crisis, we talked about leading, we talked about other leaders. So what should you take as take-home message? We talk about daring. Daring is showing courage. But courage is not being rash and brash. It is being extremely methodical and starting with acceptance and knowledge of how to go about doing it. And so what I want to leave with you is an acronym, DARE, the word dare. The first one is, we just have to accept that disruption is here, real, and will come from any direction, anytime. So there's no point in fretting about it, fuming about it, and trying to hope for avoiding. It is here. It will be here. It'll be in personal lives and professional lives, in macroeconomic crisis. It's here. Our learning from the last few years is when disruption happens, if you are digitally savvy, like many of us are, with all the digital equipment that we have today, education is going digital, health is going digital, we are all going digital. It helps, it really helps. The second one is all that we learned from people who have had in far, far more difficult, challenging situations than we are. We have a choice that helps us to adapt, be authentic, and thereby inspire others around us to see and then get hope to survive. Viktor Frankl is a great example for me, just as there were other examples. Staying resilient. Remember those examples that I talked about, at least 2 case studies I said, about the COO who persisted and not limited himself despite month after month his son could not find a solution. And even when he found one, super high-risk solution, only 8 people had survived. Or of Mongorian, who said, standing tall despite being paralyzed, but still feeling damn good on top of the world. And finally, of course, executing quite excellently. It's not about what we know. It's about how we take what we know into everyday activity, being in the eye of the storm, acting consistently, communicating hard, and just repeating that again and again and again for people to join us and go into that execution mode absolutely excellently. I did want to have a word of caution because sometimes the way I have presented may make it sound as if adversities, really hardships should be glorified. No, just to be clear, bad things are still bad. Because those hardships or adversities, or as they say, people going through cancer or other problems, is painful, very challenging physically, emotionally, spiritually, absolutely. The point I'm making is you may not have a choice of what is the stimulus and the adversity that hits you, but you do have a choice of how you respond, how we respond. And it is exactly in that freedom of choice, it is exactly in that level of resilience that we can dare to actually go through it. And when I was putting the presentation together and I shared it with one or two, I shared it with my son. And he said, "This is all very good. What next? You said all this, what will you do next?" And I did want to, before I close, share with you that yes, that does trigger some thoughts about what should we be thinking about. How do we build this reservoir of resilience? What have you learned from the CEOs in terms of methods, tools, and techniques? Hopefully, I'll get a chance to share that in some time. And of course, as a person who is very, very keen learner about a lot of the ancient wisdom from, Vedanta and other great texts of the past, and the modern psychology, what can we create as a magic potion that can help us lead better in this turbulent days? But with that, I do want to say thank you for listening, and thank you for the opportunity to Professor Shailendra and team, and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Raghuraman. Thank you, Director Sir. Director Sir, would you have any queries for our speaker regarding his presentation? Any comments? Yes.
I'll say whatever Raghu has presented is a less academic, more experiential, that he has actually experienced himself through those executives whom he has actually interacted to get where they have experienced and how they have managed their lives and careers. And very aptly, that has been symbolized in terms of DARE. So there is a acronym, and there is actually also saying that let us dare to lead and conduct ourselves in the situation of crisis. On my side, you may be having many questions from the chat box, so you can take them.
Thank you, Director Sir. We now move on to questions from the chat box. We have Arpit Parnerkar asking, Dr. Raghuraman, thank you for the great talk. Another facet which becomes important to resilience for a leader perhaps becomes to project outwards its resilience, or as Bob Iger called in his recent memoir, optimism. Did you come across the conversations with CEOs any insights towards this externally, example in an organization?
Good question, and thank you, Arpit. I'm going to take 15 seconds of a bit of theory. There is, in the last 20 years, a huge portion of psychology, which is called positive psychology. And it's kind of recent. If you went back 50 years, 100 years, psychology was focused on problems. What is it that people have problems? Why do they have disorders and things like that? Positive psychology focuses on what is good with people, strengths. It talks about hope, talks about optimism, it talks about resilience. So in my interviews, yes, people did talk about optimism, but the nuance is important. It is not about expecting to stay optimistic as you go through it. It is about creating optimism in others by showing your resilience, by your actions that infuses optimism in others to come out. In the example that I shared here of the chairman, what he actually explained in great detail is how he could activate the forces. Another person who was a vice chairman talked about how when the Lehman crash happened, and just months before that, they had gone public in terms of a large organization and very successful. And he said, the first thing is this is going to come and hit us. We had to respond. And I had to, despite all the gloom and doom around, we had to infuse a level of optimism for action. So it's almost like learned optimism in order to act, but not just staying optimistic and hoping for the best. You have to be in action. Execution is key when you have to respond to a crisis. So that's the key. So yes, they talked about optimism, but in this angle.
Thank you, Dr. Raghuraman. We have a second question from Mr. Naveen Narayanan. He asked, what role does faith and spirituality play in resilience? What are the one or two things that we can do in resilience in kids, say between 7 to 15 years when they're moldable? Before you take the answer, Dr. Raghuraman, I would like to say that we'll take one more question from the chat box. So in case you have any question, please put it in the chat box while Dr. Raghuraman is answering this question.
So Naveen, very interesting question. And it was also something that I was probing in my doctoral research. Different people from different backgrounds anchored to faith and spirituality differently. So if you look at the whole canvas of all the people I spoke to, did everybody talk about spirituality? No. But those who did, many of them did, they actually used, or in the sense of related to spirituality, as a means to detach themselves. In fact, people said, it almost gave me a sense of serendipity. I was probing it as an adventure as I was going through a crisis, knowing with some level of confidence that you could call as faith, that good will come out of it and we will find a way out of it. I've had people who actually said, I was comfortable because I was detached. To me, spirituality is detachment, is what one of the CEOs said, because it gave me strength and thereby gave me the courage to take bold and tough actions. And as you know, spirituality is a pretty broad area and people have used it differently, but absolutely yes. Many of the CEOs who said they were spiritual, not everybody did, but many who did, in fact, felt it gave them a bit of a bouncing board to anchor themselves, detach themselves, and go into actions and execution with a level of comfort. The second question of yours is interesting, which is about kids, children. How do you build resilience? Resilience is a learned skill, I said. It is a learning process. How do you get kids to learn? Well, you have to allow kids to fail. You have to allow kids to play games in which they lose. Sports is a great one. In fact, one of the CEOs I interviewed talked about his experience in school days, early college days, in basketball, of how he was good, but not so good to play for the college. And for like 5 years, he was in the team, but never got to play. And he would go back at the end of the year and work harder and harder and harder. So, and he said, every year I felt like a failure. And then fast forward 30 years, he became a CEO, and his first year was a complete failure. He says, I was a failure. Failure in the market, failure to my people, did not grow my business. So the trigger to help kids is to learn, to try, experiment, fail. Because it is there that they learn that it is okay, safe to fail actually, and they learn something from that failure that builds that resilience. It is hardships from the present that build the reservoir for the future. That is a very hard finding in my research, that as you go through many experiences and difficulties, it's like an inflating balloon of resilience reservoir that helps you get better and better. So that's probably what I would say. Okay, one more question as the people said. Hopefully that answered Naveen.
Thank you, Dr. Raghuraman. We do not have any questions from the chat box. We, however, have one question from the center. As you had mentioned during your presentation, that the COVID crisis is something that is completely new. That is something which none of us probably has faced something like this in the past. So, what do you think could be one key differentiating factor for leaders who could differentiate the people who come out from this crisis from the also ranks who tried to tackle this crisis?
Agility. What COVID has taught us is agility. Because I cannot imagine just take colleges, IIMs, schools thinking of doing virtual learning, virtual classrooms. So in literally 2 months, we have erected the infrastructure, we are training the teachers, we are training the children, we are putting in the technology to enable and continue the important process of learning. It is agility that is a core learning coming out of COVID. COVID is not done yet. It's still extremely painful, but coming out of that is organizations, institutions, individuals, teams are all learning that they need to be quick, they need to learn, they need to change and do it faster and faster. I mean, it's almost like the pond is getting filled up with flowers, doubling every day. And we are on day 29, it's going to be full tomorrow. We have to change. And that agility comes for us in every organization, individual, and institution. That is what organizations carry, and every organization will come out stronger, better, far more capable. And so I think the next decade will see more experimentation and more success. That's my expectation.
Thank you, Dr. Raghuraman. In case we do not have any more questions at the moment, I do not see any further questions. I would like to hand it over to Professor Mishra, who will present the vote of thanks on behalf of IIM.
Thank you, Professor Hazarika. Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hazarika. Honorable Director, sir, today's speaker, respected Dr. G Raghuraman, and all the participants. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Center for Leadership, Policy and Governance and IIM Ranchi, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the Honorable Speaker and participants who blessed us with their presence and took out valuable time of your busy schedule. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Dr. Raghuraman for his work. I especially liked Dr. Raghuraman's energetic speech, where he suggested to take the bull by horns. And I think this is the effective way of handling crisis. The way he explained the topic is exemplary. I also wish to express my gratitude to our director, sir, for providing encouragement and support. I am very grateful to my colleague, Professor Hazarika, and center staff, Ms. Prachi, for conducting this webinar. And as we know that no webinar can become successful without IT department. So I extend my big thank to Balaji and the entire IT department for their support. Thank you everyone for making this webinar successful with your contribution. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Director, sir. Thank you, Dr. Raghuraman. And hope to see you in our next one.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.